Welcome to Accelerating Climate Solutions for a World That Works.
Stanford University.
Climate change is no longer theoretical. It's here. Atmospheric CO2 is 40% higher than in pre-industrial times. Heat waves are more intense. Droughts are more severe. Wildfire risk is up. Sea levels are rising. Heavier rains are causing devastating floods. Infectious diseases are spreading as mosquito habitat zones expand. Economic inequality is growing. By 2050, Earth's population will reach perhaps 9 billion, requiring even more energy and food without the greenhouse gases. At Stanford, we are looking at solutions from every angle. I'm a climate scientist.
I'm an environmental lawyer.
I'm an earth scientist.
I am a biologist.
I'm a glaciologist.
I'm an energy scientist.
I'm a behavioral decision scientist.
I'm an atmospheric scientist.
I'm an earth scientist.
I'm a geophysicist.
I'm an ecologist.
I'm a climate scientist.
I work at the intersection of environmental engineering and infrastructure planning.
In order to understand climate change, we need to understand the full Earth system.
Sea level rise is having consequences for people who live on the coast. Putting careful numbers around how much the ice sheets will contribute to that is a critical component in creating thoughtful, informed policy and adaptation measures.
If we were able to say, in the next 10-year period, we are going to have 5 or 7 or 8 winters that are going to be anomalously bad compared with the normal. Now, that would be tremendously useful.
What we've experienced in California over the last couple of years is that climate damages are now. Scores are killed, tens of thousands of homes burned down. There is enormous investment in trying to improve the modeling approaches to wildfire risk, to understand what is the risk at your house.
These types of events, like extreme weather events, tend to help people make that link between climate change and their lives.
Climate change is really a side effect of something that benefits humanity. We need access to energy resources, and the combustion of fossil fuels release greenhouse gases to the atmosphere.
We can't solve the climate problem without solving the energy problem. We recognize that having a reliable, low-cost electricity system is absolutely crucial. We're at the forefront of technologies in batteries, in solar and wind and geothermal and hydropower, carbon capture and storage, natural gas as a transition fuel. At the end of the day, we can develop all the technologies that we want, but what's really going to make a difference is whether we implement them.
The entire world could lose 20% of GDP this century if we fail to do anything about climate change.
We can put a price tag on services provided by nature. The Natural Capital Project is playing a major role in the transformation underway in China. We're helping to develop a suite of new technology that will transform the way investments are made in nature. And these software tools are being used by 185 countries.
So in Costa Rica, we're partnered with some of the government agencies that are really interested in learning how we can apply these ecological concepts to improve policy around both land management and human disease risk.
A couple of colleagues and I myself have started a company that's serving data to the needs of the developing world to really push forward whether we're able to feed the populations with the existing land that we have.
My group works with local governments in countries like Haiti and Mozambique and Bangladesh to engineer water and sanitation solutions that really fit.
We are working with San Mateo County to understand socioeconomic impacts of sea level rise. We are also working with San Jose to better understand compound risk from flooding.
So we have a new administration in Sacramento. We're trying to help them think through how can you move towards 100% renewable power.
Some of our emissions work has ended up in state laws and federal laws.
I've had the opportunity to testify before Congress about building a climate resilient America.
We're already finding solutions today. What we need even more of is leadership, consensus, investment, and something that's already happening, excitement and energy from a new generation.
Stanford has really done a phenomenal job of laying the foundations to now meet one of the most critical existential threats of the 21st century, and that is meeting climate change. We have to drive solutions at scale by advancing fundamental science, technology, and future partnerships. We're ready, we have the foundation, and now we need to launch into the future.
Please welcome to the stage President of Stanford University, Marc Tessier-Lavigne.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here this afternoon, especially on such a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I want to thank you for your interest. I want to thank you for the commitment that you're showing by coming here today to tackling some of the great issues of our day, how to create a sustainable future for our planet, and in particular, how to accelerate solutions for climate. I think we all appreciate that we're at a critical juncture today, that we have the opportunity to change the trajectory that we're on, to create a different future for our planet, and to create a better and more sustainable world. But it will require action on our part. It will require action urgently. In the next few minutes, I'd like to just share a few thoughts, first about the urgency of the challenge that's facing us, then the reasons why I am guardedly optimistic that we can make a big difference in the trajectory that we're going on. And part of that is, of course, because of the work that's being done here at Stanford by our experts who are helping lead the way, some of whom you'll hear from this afternoon. Now, the video highlighted many of the urgent issues that are facing us today and have reminded us that we're at a defining moment in human history. The first predictions of global warming came almost 50 years ago. It's a sobering thought, and it's even more sobering to think that those predictions were eerily accurate about where we are today and the trajectory that we're on today. I think it's become increasingly apparent that the nature of the threat is incredibly serious. This has been hammered home by many events over the past decades, over the past years, over the past months. This summer has been a summer of extremes of temperature, extremes of climate events. And there's greater recognition of the importance of this. The UN Climate Solutions, our summit, just occurred a few weeks ago in New York. Perhaps more poignantly, the youth strikes that have occurred all across the world have shown that the young people of the world are rising and adding their voices and their sense of urgency to the issue as well. Now, each of us, I think, feels this at a very personal level. For me, this was really captured very movingly by a healthcare worker who was cited in the Washington Post. And this person said, "I'm deathly afraid, not for my kids, but for my kids' kids and what they will have to deal with. What are we leaving as a legacy besides a hot mess?" Now, the commitment that I see in this room by all of you who have come here today, by our faculty, by our students, shows to me that we all believe that our legacy does not have to be a hot mess, but we know that we have to tackle the problem today and that we cannot delay. Now, I am guardedly optimistic about the future, and that is, of course, grounded in my appreciation of the work that's happening here at Stanford, as well as at many other institutions around the world. Institutions like Stanford can bring people together, can help catalyze new ideas, can help accelerate the development of new technologies, can create new knowledge free of ideology, and also help us act quickly and nimbly, and all of that is necessary for us to get to a better place. This type of work really is part of the DNA of Stanford from its founding in 1891. The purpose of the university is to generate knowledge and applications to better the human condition. The university has actually been at the forefront of climate science since the 1970s, and especially in the last 15 years, we made huge investments in this area. Many of the early pioneers of those efforts, many of the generous partners who have supported those efforts are actually here today. So I want to thank them, all of those who are here, for all their hard work over the years and also the clear commitment that they showed to continuing this fight by their presence here today. In the last 2 years as a university, we've worked collectively to define where we want to go with the university over the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. We've been doing this across all fields, but we've had a very big focus on sustainability. Our vision has been coming into focus. The plans are being crafted and should be finalized in the next month or two. They include a number of priorities. One focused on transforming our energy system, including the grid. The second on accelerating the development of sustainable technology solutions, for example, for carbon capture, for batteries, for many other things. Also, a focus on adaptability and resilience, and especially to protect the most vulnerable communities in our region, in our nation, around the world. And also to use economic analysis and policy formulation to try to create incentives to protect the planet and its inhabitants. In addition to our work in research, in engineering, in policy development, we believe we have an opportunity and in fact a responsibility to lead by example, taking advantage of our campus community, about 35,000 people, really a small town if you will, and to be a living laboratory for the implementation and development of sustainability solutions. Over the past several years, we've made the commitment to decarbonize our campus. From our peak less than 10 years ago, we are now 65%. We've reduced our carbon emissions by 65%. In 2 years, in 2021, we will be 80% carbon-free, and then we will drive it to completion. We've also have a focus and a commitment on waste reduction, recovering clean water and energy from wastewater, and we've made the commitment to be waste-free by 2030. As we do this, as we experiment on our campus, as we generate data and experience and new tools and implement them, we also believe it's essential that we engage and share all of our best practices with other universities, with non-governmental organizations, with corporations, with governments around the world. We have to share all of these best practices so we can accelerate the development and the implementation of sustainability solutions at the local level as well. What makes me most optimistic is the brilliance of our faculty and our students, some of whom you will see today. Their drive, their expertise, their ingenuity, their tremendous insights are extraordinary, and above all, their unrelenting commitment and their passion to tackle the problem is what inspires me every day. So, in conclusion, I want to reiterate my optimism. But of course, we know that we can't just be optimistic, we actually have to get down to work. We also have to focus on pulling all the levers. There's no single lever that we can pull to get to the solution. We have to pull all of them. No one person, no one institution, no one nation can solve this problem for all of us. We have to work collectively. This is a global problem that requires each of us to engage, but each of us to engage also with our communities and communities around the world. But I believe that Stanford is well positioned to help lead in this through bold and transformational ventures. And with your help, I think that we can go the distance. So I want to thank you again for being here. I want to thank you for being part of the solution of what is perhaps the biggest problem and gravest problem facing humanity today. Thank you very much.
The other day, I was teaching about 50 political journalists about climate change. And they were absolutely shocked to learn that we could reach the 2 degrees C climate threshold in 30 years or less. Now, maybe 30 years sounds like a long time, but in infrastructure years, 30 years is just the blink of an eye. Think, for example, how long it took to rebuild the Bay Bridge after the 1989 earthquake. But the reality is that we have to get off the path that we've been on, where carbon dioxide emissions that cause climate change continue to rise year after year. We have to bend the curve and drive emissions down to zero sometime in the latter half of the century. Now, what I would like to do is talk with you today about why I'm optimistic that we can deal with this challenge. But first, let's step back and take a look at the source of the emissions that cause global warming. About 76% of these carbon dioxide emissions come from energy, that is, burning fossil fuels. So that's the good news, and that's the bad news. And the bad news is that fossil fuels provide very reliable and relatively low-cost energy that's really the backbone of our modern economy. So we can't afford to jeopardize that. But the good news we can see is that if we can eliminate the emissions from the energy sector, we've dealt with the lion's share of this problem. Now, 10 years ago, if you asked me whether we could reduce the energy system's emissions to zero, I would have said it's impossible. But the reality is that solar panels, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries, the prices for these zero emissions technologies has plummeted over the last decade. And in fact, these technologies now often provide the lowest cost source of electricity we have. And because of the low cost of lithium-ion batteries, we can also now have electric cars, and we can use these same batteries to back up the electric grid when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. So in fact, it should really come as no surprise that in some parts of the world, these technologies are being adopted very quickly. And in fact, there are many places where over 50% of all the electricity they use actually comes from these renewable resources. And something that I never thought that I would see in my lifetime, for the first time ever in the United States, for the entire electricity system, renewable energy generation topped coal. I never thought that I would see that in my lifetime. That's truly incredible. I agree, that's truly incredible. So then I'm sure you're saying, well, why can't we go farther? And why can't we go faster? And why isn't everybody doing this? Well, the electricity system was built when we had coal plants and gas plants. And you can turn them on when you want, and you can turn them off when you want, and you can control how much power they put out. But we can't control the wind, and we can't control the sun. So integrating these new technologies into the grid is like putting together a puzzle. All the pieces have to fit together in the right way. We need to figure out ways where we can figure out what is the right combination of wind resources and solar resources and battery electric storage. And how do we charge the tens of millions of electric vehicles that we're going to have? We need to figure out how to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And this, I'll tell you, is the forefront of innovation in energy technology today. And Stanford faculty are leaders in all of these areas and can bring their tremendous talents together to address these issues. I can tell you, here in Silicon Valley, you're sitting in the epicenter of energy innovation here at Stanford and the Valley. There are over 1,700 energy-related companies in the Bay Area today. Who would have thought that just a decade ago? So grid operators are going to need much more data than they've had in the past to operate the grid reliably. And we're going to need to analyze this data in real time so we can optimize how all these pieces fit together. And we're going to need to send control signals to tens of millions of devices on the grid so that we can make this system work. This is the frontier of energy innovation. Due to the urgency of climate change and due to the availability of these low-cost solutions, many nations, states, counties, cities, corporations, and universities like Stanford are developing their own ambitious climate goals. And in fact, many have committed to 100% zero-emission energy system. But they'll be the first ones to tell you they don't know how to get there. And that's where Stanford can help. We're working together with our partners to identify solutions that they can implement today and continue to implement further into the future so they too can get to zero emissions. A really good example is our work with the state of California. California has committed to 100% clean electricity by 2045. So we're using our models and computational algorithms to figure out what's the best combination of renewable generation, battery storage, combined with traditional generation to drive towards zero emissions, but at the lowest possible cost. And this is important because transitioning to zero emissions has to be affordable. Driving towards zero emissions, though, is not a linear process. It's a cycle. So just like diet and exercise are vital for human health, implementation and innovation are vital for the health of our planet. We call this platform of innovation and implementation Zero Emissions Energy Solutions. Now that's quite a mouthful, so I just like to call it Z's. And one of the best things about Z's is that the solutions we create together with our partners are made available through an open source toolkit so that everyone around the world can benefit from the solutions we develop. I'd like to switch now to thinking about the future, thinking about innovation in the future, and what the next 10 to 20 years looks like to us. I'm going to give you 4 examples. The first example will be about batteries. Stanford faculty are working on batteries that can store twice as much energy. So what does that mean? You can drive twice as far in your car, but maybe even more important, we'll be able to start to electrify heavy-duty trucking. And what about hydrogen? Hydrogen is the cleanest fuel. When you burn it, the only thing that comes out of your tailpipe is water. But making hydrogen from renewable energy today is just too expensive. So Stanford faculty are developing new materials and new processes so that we can make low-cost hydrogen from renewable energy. And what I show here is a sector that is often overlooked when we think about zero emissions, and that is the industrial sector. About 25% of carbon dioxide emissions come from the industrial sector. So we have to deal with this too. Iron and steel, cement, chemicals, aluminum. These are the materials of our modern economy. And today, we make them with fossil fuels. And unfortunately, we don't have a good substitute yet. So this is where carbon dioxide capture and storage comes in. We can capture the carbon dioxide from the smokestack before it ever gets into the atmosphere. We can purify it, and we can put it back underground where it came from in the first place. And Stanford faculties are leaders in making sure that this can be done safely and effectively. And I'll give you just one more example. So imagine one day that we would be able to make liquid fuels like gasoline and diesel from renewable energy. Well, our faculty are working taking carbon dioxide from the air, combining that with water, and making those exact same fuels that our economy relies on today. That would be a game changer. So I can tell you, we can actually do this in our laboratories today, but it's too expensive, way too expensive, and it's not very efficient. So discouraging maybe, but what I want you to do is to think back to the 1970s when we first started manufacturing solar panels. They were way too expensive and they weren't very efficient. But look at what a couple of decades of innovation has done. Solar energy is now some of the lowest cost energy in the world today. This is why I'm hopeful. Climate change is a complicated issue requiring multifaceted solutions. Yes, we need renewable energy, and yes, we need better batteries, and yes, we need electric cars, and yes, we need carbon dioxide capture and storage. And yes, we need to accelerate implementation of those technologies that are cost-effective today. And yes, we need to continue to innovate because we still have lots of work to do. We need it all. That's what zero emissions energy solutions are all about. And we here at Stanford are committed to ensuring that the innovations in our laboratories are implemented in the real world, and that what we learn with our partners fuels the next cycle of innovation. Thank you.
I'm a medical epidemiologist. That means I'm a physician, but instead of treating individual patients, I focus on patterns of disease in whole communities. My particular expertise is infectious diseases in low-income countries, so it might seem a little odd that I'm on a panel talking about climate solutions. But it turns out that the pollution that affects the climate, much of it also affects human health. For the 8 years before I joined Stanford, I was living in Bangladesh. If you look on a map, Bangladesh looks like a small country. And in fact, it is only the size of the state of Iowa, but it has a population equivalent to half of the US. Because it's a low-lying delta of the Ganges River, it is one of the countries most affected by rising sea levels. What is less commonly known is it's also a country with particularly bad air pollution, amongst the worst in the world. Each winter, a brown cloud forms over the top of Bangladesh. As a physician studying pneumonia, the leading cause of death among children globally, I became particularly concerned about the impact of this air pollution on the health of the people living in Bangladesh. So as I started to think more and work and consider this air pollution, it took me to the brick fields outside of Dhaka. And if you go outside of any city in South Asia, you'll see similar brick fields. And that's because these dynamic economies are powered by buildings that are being built out of bricks. This is the grist of these dynamic economies. But these brick fields also generate 40% of the particulate matter in Dhaka, the capital city, during the wintertime. And modeling suggests that this air pollution results in 5,000 deaths each year in Dhaka. And it's not just a local health problem. If you think about the brick kilns across all of South Asia, they generate as much impact on the climate as the entire US passenger car fleet. When I was discussing this situation with the chairman of the Bangladesh Brick Manufacturer Owners Association, he said to me, "Steve, we know we have problems. What we need is help with solutions." And then he paused for a while and he said, "We were hoping that Stanford could help." Now, if you want to engage in complex public health problems, you need to understand the perspectives of stakeholders. You need to work with stakeholders over the long term. So we need to understand the perspective of the people who are making the bricks, of the people who are buying the bricks, and the people who are responsible for regulating brick kilns. So we conducted in-depth anthropologic study to understand the system of incentives that was generating a system whereby we were making bricks with such highly polluting kilns. And what we learned is that these type of brick kilns offer a compelling business model. The inexpensive bricks dominate the market. And the kiln owners earn 80% return on investment in a single year. And since Bangladesh is a weak state, the regulators have very little capacity to enforce. At the request of stakeholders, we're also generating evidence that links the emissions from brick kilns to the health of the community. Our stakeholders are trying to generate information for action because they find that Bangladeshi decision makers are more interested in data that talks about the number of deaths, the 5,000 deaths in their city, rather than talking about something more abstract like global climate change. So as we've considered this network of incentives, we have begun thinking about incentive-compatible interventions. So this would be an intervention that stakeholders are interested to take up, and so that we don't need the government to enforce a regulation. So this is a picture of a natural draft chimney kiln. The tall chimney so increases the updraft that the kiln no longer needs a motor and a fan to drive air through. In fact, there's so much air flowing through that when this is combined with a particular layout of the kiln, of the bricks, in a zigzag pattern, you actually improve combustion efficiency so much that this kiln generates 25%, consumes 25% less coal per brick and generates 85% less black carbon. And the savings on the coal in the first year pay for the upgrade. So this is an intervention that is good for climate, that is good for health, and is also good business. And so these type of efficiency improvements, these incentive-compatible interventions, we're working on a suite of these. And it's not just the technology, because we're trying to drive system uptake. And one of the barriers to system uptake is just basic information. People who want to improve brick manufacturing in Bangladesh don't have basic information about where the kilns are, what their design is, whether they're operating or not. The government has some information, but the information is inaccurate, not publicly available. So we turned to standard undergraduates who started as part of a course to use satellite imagery from Bangladesh and develop a machine learning algorithm to look at images that had kilns and images that did not, and create an algorithm that could predict whether there was a new kiln in a new image, and then extract the pixels that triggered that identification, and then use that to generate a GPS coordinate. Now, this is really clever, cutting-edge computer science. But what excites me is these students are turning satellite data into information that our stakeholders can use to improve brick manufacturing in Bangladesh. And so we're now tying some of this image data to recommendations in Bengali for kiln owners of steps they can take to save coal. I'm very gratified by the collaboration between Stanford and my colleagues in Bangladesh. But I realize that the world doesn't hear very much about these types of efforts. Our news media seems to be a daily barrage of bad news that has an underlying disempowering narrative. The narrative suggests that climate change is inexorable, that the strong economic and political forces driving it will overwhelm what anyone can do. I want to offer an alternative narrative. Climate change is a human-generated problem. Humans can stop it. I joined Stanford 7 years ago because of Stanford's commitment to work with stakeholders to go into the world and work on hard problems, the types of problems that surrounded me when I was in Bangladesh. I continue to be excited to come to Stanford every day because I engage with students who bring their enthusiasm, their interest, and their new perspectives to these problems. I can tell you from personal experience that Stanford students love to work on solutions. Now, our work on brick kilns is still incomplete. Because we're engaged in a hard problem in the world, we have made a lot of mistakes. But because we've embraced the Stanford ethos, we're also learning from each of these mistakes. I'm sure we will make mistakes in the future, but have no doubt we are making progress.
Fresh water. So when I say that word, how many of you thought of this? Hands up. The water in the lakes and reservoirs. But you realize this water that we can see on the surface of the ground is only 3% of the liquid fresh water on this planet. 97% is hidden below the ground surface, down hundreds of meters. Yes, the tree is not to scale. And this is our groundwater. We often describe our groundwater as our freshwater savings account. We store large volumes of water down there, and it's there for when we need it. It's there for a rainy day, or actually it's there for a not so rainy day when we have our droughts and there's limited precipitation. The water levels in our lakes and reservoirs start going down, and so we turn to groundwater and we pump groundwater to the surface. So we've often assumed that there's this large, unlimited supply of groundwater down there that will always be there when we need it. But climate change is causing us to rethink this assumption. Climate change is already having an impact on our groundwater resources. Because of the increasing number and severity of droughts, we're turning more and more to our groundwater. And all around the world, including in California, water levels are going down. We are depleting our savings account. This is already happening now and is only going to get worse. And at the same time, we have a planet with a population on its way to 10 billion people. So how are we going to deal with this double whammy of climate change and people? How are we going to provide the water that 10 billion people are going to need, also recognizing this is a shared resource, and there are natural ecosystems also dependent upon this water? What are we going to do? We need new solutions. So the solution I'm working on with my students and colleagues is to provide the support needed for effective, sustainable groundwater management so that we can ensure the long-term quantity and quality of our groundwater resources. So management. So how do you manage a groundwater system down there, hidden below the ground surface? Well, you need to start by mapping out the plumbing system. So where's the sand and gravel? The sand and gravel is critical. That's where there are large volumes of water that we can pump to the surface. And very simple model of the subsurface, where's the clay? Clay also contains water, but drains very slowly. So once we get an idea of what's down there, then we have to put the ins and outs into this picture. And the outs, it's primarily us, driving wells down into that sand and gravel and pulling that water up to the surface. And it's critically important that we have some ins. So how is water getting back into this system to maintain some balance? When it rains, water gets down on the ground surface and can move through pathways down to these sand and gravel regions, and this process is called recharge. This is what replenishes, adds water back to the sand and gravel. So sustainable management, it requires a model of the groundwater system, a model that allows a manager to predict the response of the climate change and take action. So we need a sufficiently accurate model so that the predictions we make are going to be reliable. So I know what you're thinking. So she's up there with a picture, drawing circles and arrows going in and out, but what does a groundwater manager typically know about the groundwater resources in their area? Just a little bit more than this. So how do we get data about what's down there? Most information is acquired by drilling wells. And drilling wells are great. They give you a lot of information, but the problem is the information is right where you drill your well. So huge question marks as to what's happening between your well locations, or particularly below the depth of your wells. So I often compare the challenge groundwater managers face, we all face right now, in managing our groundwater resources, to the challenge doctors faced at the start of the 20th century. They had their own form of drilling wells. It was called exploratory surgery. And then along came medical imaging. And medical imaging revolutionized the approach to managing human health. My vision is that Earth imaging is going to revolutionize the approach to managing the health of our groundwater systems. Well, we can't exactly do this. But I am working with my students on a number of different Earth imaging technologies, Earth imaging systems, and exploring various ways we can use Earth imaging to study, thereby understand, and therefore manage our groundwater systems. Well, because they only gave me 8 minutes today instead of the 8 hours I asked for, I'm only going to be able to talk about one of these amazing Earth imaging systems. and it's the airborne electromagnetic system. This is a helicopter deployed system that moves this imaging instrument across the ground surface. The question we've been asking, can we use this to image the groundwater systems of California? Can we use this to see below the ground hundreds of meters to figure out what's down there? How does this system work? By mapping out the electrical resistivity of the subsurface. It's an electromagnetic method. We map out where there are conductive regions down there, where are there resistive regions down there. And then what we're working on is then transforming that geophysical property map into what's really needed. Where are the clays down there? Where's the sand and gravel down there? So we conducted a pilot study now a little over 2 years ago, working in Tulare Irrigation District, which is the yellow squares in the San Joaquin Valley in the southern part of the Central Valley. We partnered with two fantastic groundwater managers, Paul Hendrick and Aaron Fukuda. They needed information about their groundwater system. Could we use this Earth imaging system to get the information they need? And it was an incredible success. So you're looking at a Google Earth image, so Google Earth on the bottom. These data were all acquired below the surface. They're projected on top just to keep track of where we are. This is the electrical resistivity. We're seeing down to 500 meters, mapping out the properties of the subsurface. The spatial density of data is incredible. It's as if you drill a well every 60 meters and go down 500 meters and figure out what's there. So now we've transformed it to a map. Sand and gravel is the yellow. Clay is the blue. Having an image of their groundwater system like this allows the groundwater managers to understand what's happening now and to think about what could happen in the future. In this area, there's a lot of drilling from the yellow sand and gravel. But images such as this reveal the large amount of clay that's present and is helping them understand how pumping from the sand and gravel is draining the clay. And that's what's causing the massive subsidence in this area. The ground is sinking up to 20 centimeters a year in this area. Draining the clays is also what's bringing the arsenic into their drinking water. And images such as this are allowing them to find new solutions to what is fundamentally the key problem there. It's a system out of balance. The water coming out is far exceeding the water going in. So they look at images like this and find locations where there's sand on the ground surface and look for sand pathways down to the deeper parts of the groundwater system that they're pumping and figure out how recharge could actually get down and replenish the groundwater supply. And they're no longer relying on natural recharge. It rains, the water trickles down. They are flooding zones of the surface, either flooding fields or putting in place basins that can capture stormwater. And so images such as this allow them to think strategically about correcting this imbalance that we have. So what's happening now? Well, this pilot study, I'm thrilled to say, was such a success. I now have everyone from individual growers, water agencies, state agencies, the governor's office asking, how can we do this throughout California? And I'm really thrilled to tell you that the planning is underway to adopt this Earth imaging technology as the basis for groundwater management in California. Yeah, no, it's like, yes! It's those moments in your life when you go tick on one of those big boxes that you've had. So what I'm doing right now is leading a 2-year pilot project. We're halfway through, and it's how do we scale this up? How can we deploy this system to image the groundwater basins of California? So we're partnering with 3 water agencies. The funding's coming from these local agencies, state agencies, working with a great team of people, and hot off the press, data that we acquired up in Butte County in the northern part of the Central Valley. Instead of the pilot where I had 100 kilometers of data, we have 800 kilometers of data. Everywhere the helicopter flew, we can see down 350 meters. And this is mapping out the electrical resistivity, where the reds are. It's where we have sands and gravels. The blue is clay rich. But the water managers up there are just thrilled to have data like this, imaging the subsurface as the basis for their management efforts. So we're working on new solutions. We're working on new solutions to have Earth imaging adopted as the basis for managing our groundwater resources. And I can tell you, as an earth scientist, I have seen this not only as an opportunity to do fascinating research with wonderfully talented students and colleagues, but I've also seen this repeatedly as a responsibility. At Stanford, working with my students, we are generating new knowledge. And I truly believe that with that knowledge comes responsibility. Responsibility to take that knowledge into action. And in case you haven't been able to tell, I love doing that. And that's the main reason I'm here at Stanford. I can't imagine any other institution where I would get the level of encouragement, the level of support that I get to go out from here, partner with water agencies, and work to find new solutions to the management of our most precious resource, our fresh water. Thanks. Thank you.
With headlines like these, it's easy to feel despair. It's easy to feel paralyzed. If you are anything like me, these kinds of headlines might send you into a tailspin. You might want to go home, sit on the couch, tuck into a half-gallon of ice cream, and binge watch your favorite Netflix series, and maybe call a friend and complain about the state of the world. In fact, there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that we would not be alone. Just last week, any of you who live in California may have heard there was a KQED California report reporting on more climate support groups growing up around the nation. And the American Psychological Association even has a guide for practitioners who are dealing with individuals and communities feeling a growing sense of climate despair. Yet, if you were to turn your head a different way, if you were to read a little bit further down the newspaper, if you were to look even just in the same day, you could see very different headlines. And in fact, I've challenged myself and my students to do this. On those same days, headlines may be proclaiming a very different story. And I'm here today to suggest that there's a different way to think about the climate narrative. We have the power to transform that narrative. And I believe that all of you are here today because you are excited about transforming that narrative. In fact, you said yes to an invitation today to come to an event on climate solutions. And you have heard from all of my colleagues today, starting from the president through all of the other speakers, and you will finish with the students today. All of us are talking about climate solutions. We can transform that narrative, and in fact, I would suggest that it's imperative that we transform that narrative, because narrative is powerful. Narrative is the story that we tell ourselves as individuals. It's also the story that we tell our societies. And there are many exciting and positive things that are happening. As you've heard today, we have a load of research. We have incredible technologies. We've just heard Sally and Rosemary talking about the technologies that are being adopted, that are being transformed into policies. Just several weeks ago, we had more than 6 million people engaged around the world from the ground up in positive climate actions around the world. These are people who are saying that they want their governments to do something different. And these environmental policies that have been implemented since the first Earth Day, more than 50 years ago, these are truly transforming the way that we think about the world around us. So to me, these are reasons that we should have hope. And today we are here to talk about Stanford and the things that are happening here on campus and the reasons that we here at Stanford have hope. You've just heard Steve say that he comes to work every day feeling hopeful, and I feel the same way. So today I will talk about 3 reasons that we here at Stanford and other universities and academics are feeling incredibly hopeful and trying to change this narrative, and we invite you to come along with us on that. One is that we are already in the midst of transforming this narrative from a narrative of crisis to one of hope and innovation. 2 is that we are not working in the ivory tower. You've heard examples today, exciting examples of how we're getting out into the community, We're working with government agencies, working with companies to take this ivory tower research that may have been thought of at one time as that and really change the way that we're working in the world. And 3, we are training dynamic, engaged, innovative, and passionate leaders who are transforming the way we work today and for generations into the future. So first, transforming that narrative. Before I go any further, I have to dispel this myth that I am some ridiculous Pollyanna and that I'm talking about sunshine and rainbows kind of hope. Any of you out there who know me may accuse me of that a little bit, and I admit I am an optimistic person by nature. But with regards to climate, it is challenging to feel that way. And I will say that I don't come to this narrative easily. It's one that I've come to after working for more than 2 decades in the environmental and climate fields. I worked in nonprofits in DC for 2 decades before I came to Stanford, and I've been here for about 10 years. My research group and I focus on looking at questions around what moves people and individuals and communities to positive environmental behavior. We look at what are the barriers to that and what are the motivations for that. And what we know and what others who study behavioral science know is that the narrative of fear and the narrative of crisis is not the way to move people to action. People are not moved to action by telling them that the sky is falling and it's your fault. When you tell people that, it's not a way to get people to jump out of bed in the morning with an excitement and a way to join the day. What we do know from behavioral science is that when you give people a data-based goal and you tell them that their individual actions can add up with those of others in their community, with those of others in their company or their nonprofit organization, that their country is working toward a positive goal, that's what gets people excited about moving forward toward a positive and a thriving future. I'll give you one example of a project on which a colleague and I have been working, my colleague Tom Robinson in the med school here, and I've been working with the Girl Scouts in Northern California for more than 6 years. And with these girls, we use elements from behavioral science, from learning sciences, from health sciences, to think about positive, small steps and actions that these girls can take with their friends and Girl Scouts and with their families. So these girls then go home and talk to their parents and have ongoing dialogue with each other. We have actions that the girls can take on their own to build their self-efficacy, and also actions that the girls can take with their parents to build what we call response efficacy, which is that they can see that it's actually making a difference in terms of energy efficiency. When the girls come back together with each other, they can see how those actions add up over time. So this has benefits for the economics of their home, for the conversations within their home, which as a mom to a 12-year-old, I will tell you that anything that enhances conversation within the home is a positive in my book. And we also see that over time, this actually has significant energy savings. We've done randomized control trial studies in this project, and we see that over time, this actually persists. So you may say this is only a few hundred girls in Northern California, and that is part of it, but it also has a broader impact across the country. We have more than 1.7 million Girl Scouts across the country. There are more than 750,000 adult leaders. And when you think about something like that, how it adds up over time, this is the way that we begin to create a movement. This is also an excellent example of how we take science that starts within a university and we move it out of the ivory tower into something that's actionable for our community. And this is the second reason I have for hope here, which is that we are truly every single day at Stanford dispelling this myth of the ivory tower. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this today because you've heard from every single one of my colleagues today talking about the work that we are doing outside of the ivory tower. I talk with my students all the time about how much I don't agree with the myth of the ivory tower. I don't think it actually even exists. I think that Stanford is the real world. I think every question we have derives from the real world. And one example I will give you from my own work is that I am fortunate to be the Sykes Family Director of the Eminent Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. And we are a program that is based on a solutions orientation. I have the great pleasure of seeing our students from their application to their time here on campus to the time they go out into the world as the alumni. And in fact, I believe we might have some alumni here today, which is great and exciting. And our students tell us that the reason they come to Stanford and the reason they come to EIPER is because of our solutions orientation, because they have the opportunity to work with our hundreds of faculty from across campus, to actually go out into the field, to work shoulder to shoulder, and learn from those faculty members about how to develop research questions, how to collect data, how to analyze those data, and then how to put those data into practice, working with policymakers, working with corporations, practitioners around the world. And then those students take that same orientation back with them when they go out into jobs in the world. So this is one example of how at Stanford we train our students in a way that is actionable in the real world. And this leads to my third reason for hope, which is that here at Stanford we are fostering dynamic and passionate leaders today and tomorrow. Our students are eager. They are not waiting to become leaders. When they are here, they are already leaders. So we see students in programs like EIPER and across the university who are here, and they are already leaders when they're here. And they go out in the world and continue in that leadership path. That said, I am not suggesting that we don't do something special here. As you've seen again from my colleagues today, you can see that the programs and the kinds of research that our students receive, where they receive training when they're here, is essential. We are helping them develop these skill sets, these mindsets, these frameworks that allow them to be more effective leaders. We help them learn about systems thinking. We help them learn about prototyping. We help them learn about technology, as you've just seen, about public health perspectives. All of those are critical aspects to allow them to be more effective when they go out into the world. My talk today was about enacting the purposeful university. And as you heard at the beginning from the president, that is an essential piece of Stanford from the very beginning of the founding of this university. How do we enact the purposeful university in the world? And I would suggest that our students are doing that every single day. And that is a critical piece of what gives me hope. And I would suggest to you that as you think about transforming that crisis narrative for climate and every other pressing environmental issue that we have, transforming that crisis narrative comes through looking at these hopeful leaders, looking at these leaders who are already making a difference today and for tomorrow. So while these issues are incredibly challenging, while they are thorny, while they are boundary crossing, and certainly at times terrifying, where I find hope, and I invite you to join me in that, is to think about our students who are dynamic leaders. And when I look at them and I see the hope in their eyes, I see the innovative questions they're asking, I see the way that they're making meaning of their work and the curiosity they bring to it, I think, if I could just bottle that energy and that enthusiasm and that joy that they take forward into the world, well then, I actually don't need to finish that sentence. I would invite all of you to finish that sentence for yourself when you meet them and think about the kind of magic that would be possible in the world. Thank you.